So, who wants to...
You tantalised us with this story about car ownership not being a problem, but car use is the problem. I'm one of the mistaken people who held that opinion. Could you say a bit more about that and why that's wrong?
Yeah, well, there's like a simple answer, and then there's a lot complicated. The simple answer is very simply this, right? That if you look at the travel behaviour of people who own cars and people who don't own cars, people who don't own cars hardly ever drive, right? There are, you know, obviously people sometimes borrow cars, they sometimes hire them, some of them belong to car clubs, but if you look at the group of people who don't own cars, the amount of driving they do is absolutely minuscule, right? So when you are looking at sort of policy, you know, in a broader case, if there is a policy which tends to reduce car ownership, it will reduce car use. There is a very, very strong correlation between the two. Now, obviously, you can vary them slightly. You know, there are things you can do that can persuade some people some of the time to leave the car at home, take the bus, whatever. But you see, the biggest changes that occur when somebody gives up a car are not actually about modal shift. If you look at the graphs that show, you know, this is how people who own cars travel, and this is how people who don't own cars travel. One of the interesting things about the difference is that the amount of travel that they do by other means is surprisingly similar. It's not that the people who don't have a car are kind of choosing to take the bus instead of driving. What's happening is they're actually organising their lives in a different way, which means they do less travel. Now, obviously, the causality in that is quite complicated because, okay, if somebody lives in the country, by definition, they will need to travel more. They will, you know, in most cases, will need a car. So the what causes what is complicated. But in terms of public policy, if we are serious about reducing traffic, reducing pollution, reducing CO2 emissions, then we have to pay attention to car ownership, not just to its use.
You mentioned that you were in Paris at the end of the book. What do you think of their auto-leave system?
I think it's an interesting system. I must admit, I haven't actually studied that one in any detail, and I haven't seen any research reports on it. I mean, car clubs generally is something that I'm actually doing a research project on at the moment, and they are a very important part of the mix.
Is there a successful one that you can point
to? Car clubs. They're all fairly successful. Or the ones that are, well, there have been some that entered the British market and gave up, but the ones that are still here, the big ones, the Zip Car, the City Car Club, Co-Wheels and that, they're going well. They're expanding. Some places are better than others, and one of the things that I'm looking at this research project at the moment is, okay, where does it work and where does it not work? Now, you may not be surprised to hear that some of the key things that make a car club work, some of the key things that I'm saying we need to do in order to make the whole thing work, and one of them, which is really, really high on the list, is parking controls. You know, if you look at those cities that have car clubs and see where the vehicles are stationed, they tend to be particularly concentrated within the controlled parking zones. The reason, which I guess are fairly obvious, aren't they? Because, you know, if you've got restrictions on parking, or even if a place where there is parking pressure, then people are more likely to see the advantages of doing without a car.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how your life changed when you moved from the national park to the city? You said you didn't regret that at all. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, several things. Again, I wrote an article about it at the time, and there's an extract from it in that part of the book. One of the interesting things when I was saying this book, because what happened, I got into this originally through, it was on the planning side that I really got involved. I started a campaign. I was, for my sins, a parliamentary candidate for the Lib Dems in 1997 elections. I'm no longer a member of that party, but after the election, I mean, when you are standing for election, you tend to be a bit of a hustler, really. You jump on whatever bandwagons you need to get headlines and all that. And after, and you slag off the opposition and all that. And after sort of having gone through all that, I remember thinking, look, when this is over, I'm going to spend my time doing something that I really believe in. And so for several years, I was very concerned at the time at the scale of greenfield building that was being targeted for South Devon. Had those plans gone ahead, a large part, I don't know if any of you know South Devon, basically the area in between Torbay and Plymouth, the South Hams district. Had those plans gone ahead, half of that would now be urbanised. And nobody seemed to be doing anything about it. So I set up this campaign group called SHARD, which stood for South Hams Against Rural Destruction, and for 10 years we fought that fight, and we made a lot of progress. And at that time we were pushing at an open door because government policy was changing. It was moving away from sprawl and towards regenerating cities. Now, of course, along the way, I started to realise, of course, I'd been part of the problem. I was born in a city. I'd lived in cities until the age of my 20s, and then, the moment I could afford to, I got out and got the, cottage in the countryside, which is what so many people in my generation wanted to do. And so I came to the realisation that if you really love the countryside, which I do, and I spend all my time in it, the three things the three most powerful things that you can do are go and live in the city, give up your car, and if you are like the vast majority of households in Britain, i.e. you are one or two people living in a house, sell it and go and buy a flat. Now, we were lucky in that we were able to do all three at the same time. Now, in telling that story, and you might be thinking the same thing, you may be doubting that anybody would make all of those decisions on purely altruistic grounds. And one of the things that I discovered along the way, any of you ever come across the concept of cognitive dissonance? Mm-hmm. Right, okay, we obviously got a fairly knowledgeable audience here. For those of you who haven't come across that idea, it's one of those sort of theories where, when you read about it, you suddenly think, that's why that happens. That's why people do that. It's essentially it's a psychological theory that was originally sort of postulated in the 1950s, and the various experiments have been done. And basically, what it says is that where people have a dissonance between their attitudes and their behaviour, that they will feel this psychological pressure to change either one or the other. And it tends to be strongest where there is a finely balanced decision involved. How many times have you heard people, and a good example of this is, when people talk about the place where they live, how many times have you been in a conversation and you've heard somebody giving all the reasons why the place where they live was a great choice, a great place to live? You ever remember those sorts of conversations? That's what's going on. It's, it's that psychological force that is within us that reinforces, that says, don't regret, you've made the right decision. So, now what I found was happening with me in this particular case was that as I was getting involved in all this sort of stuff, and in a sense I was absorbing some of these values, it was changing my attitude to a whole load of other things. So I started to resent the fact that we had to drive, 7 miles to go to. We were lucky having an art house cinema, 7 miles away, but you don't, places like Surrey, there are none at all, But, or if you wanted to go to the theatre, it was 18 miles into Plymouth, and I started to feel I'd had my fill of village life, really, and I felt sort of moving into middle age, and actually now was a good time to go and live in the city. So, in a sense, what was happening was that intellectual process was changing my feelings about where I should live. So probably this is quite a long answer, but having taken that decision and moved to Bristol, we're quite lucky to find somewhere which is in exactly the right spot, where 10 minutes walk from the railway station, all the buses meet there, all the cycle paths meet there. I thought when I moved there that we'd join a car club or whatever. In 6 years, I haven't driven a vehicle and I haven't felt any need to.
Change the subject again, sorry. Disabled access is something that worries me because I have a sister who's really important in that area.
Mm.
And although Cambridge is wonderful for cycling, I do sometimes worry. Actually, I have seen someone get off a bicycle and then get up 2 walking sticks, which is amazing. But generally speaking, a lot of people can't handle bicycles for one reason or another.
Tricycles.
Yeah, sometimes. And I noticed that, I can't remember which city it was, but one of the cities, they actually allowed the disabled vehicles, you know, motorised disabled vehicles on the cycle paths. And as far as I can see in England, in UK we don't. At least you are allowed to. You can take a disabled vehicle anywhere you like, provided anywhere that pedestrians are allowed, and you can't drive it more than 4 miles an hour, which is not very helpful on a cycle path. You know, it's not going to work. So, do you think we could make us a bit more disabled friendly and?
Yes, definitely, and there are several answers to that, so I'm taking one at a time. I mean, one is the principle of filtered permeability. Right, this is one of the things that I have to say. You've normally got to say this about 10 times before it sinks in. I've tried this with some journalists, it still doesn't sink in, you know, that by doing those sorts of changes, the sorts of changes that, you know, happened here, it doesn't stop anyone from driving anywhere. Right?
It just takes a bit longer.
Yeah, it just may take a bit longer. Some of them maybe. Now, while you're doing that, it actually becomes a lot easier to, you know, if you want to provide, well, you know, let's put some disabled parking spaces here. If it's in the context of overall restraint, it's much easier to do that. So that's one point. The second point, in terms of the sort of vehicles and buggies, I think, are you talking about the Netherlands, and is that what you're thinking of?
There was one particular example that you mentioned where they said that they allow motorised scooters and things on.
Yeah. Yes. No. Okay. I don't think that. I've never seen anywhere that allows, you know, as in the internal combustion engine.
Oh
vehicles.
no.
No.
But
what we're talking about is electric.
Yes.
Yes. And in the Netherlands in particular, that's a big part of what they do, and I think that's a very strong argument in favour of high quality. Cycling infrastructure of a sufficient width. In fact, I'm not even sure that we should be calling it cycling, you know, cycle routes and so on, because they are, in the Netherlands, they are heavily used by not only the sort of mobility scooters that we're all familiar with. I mean, in some cases, like, they have these sort of little buggies that are like a mini.
That's what I was
sort of
thinking.
Now, where the facility is wide enough, yes, they can. One of the other points at which, again, I made some brief reference to, there's a guy called Kevin Hickman who actually came to the talk that I did at Oxford University a few week or so ago, who is an amazing guy who I met initially because there's this bike ride called the Dartmoor Devil, which is designed to go up and down all the toughest hills on Dartmoor within, I think within 100 kilometres, and to do it against time. It's really, really hard. And in some cases, again, foul weather. And I did it quite a few years running. Kevin Hickman has done it, and done it within the time, and he's only got one leg. And so, and he's involved in sustainable transport stuff and that. And one of the interesting perspectives he's come up with, he's very critical of the way that British transport engineers of, you know, all the kind of grubby compromises that they make when they build sort of cycling infrastructure. And one of the things he pointed out is when you look at all the sort of publicity material, for all you ever see is solo bicycles, and usually sort of, you know, young, fit, smiling, good-looking people. And then he sort of, you know, he shows all these slides of saying, well, hang on, what about this, and this person? And and again, in the Netherlands, they're particularly big on this sort of thing. You know, people with a range of disabilities have a range of different things that are kind of like bicycles, or they're like a cross between a bicycle and a wheelchair, or, you know, some of them have got 2 wheels at the front, some to the back. And of course, not just people with disabilities, but, you know, kiddie trailers. You ever seen what a back feet looks like? No, those kind of
Cambridge.
right. Yeah, the cycling wheelbarrow. You know, all these other sorts of vehicles that we should be designing for. So I think if we can design for all those sorts of things, I think it can kill so many birds. One of them, I think, is an interesting presentational one, because if we can get away from... There's quite a bit in this about the designation of cyclists as an out-group. You know, the psychology of, you know, how on earth did it come to be that an activity that only generates something like 2% of the journeys in Britain, that the people who practice this activity should have been sort of demonised almost on a par with sort of Al-Qaeda, in, you know, for some people. Well, the reasons for that, again, are all sort of psychological. It's about, you know, the creation of outgroups. And one of the... So, you know, if for a certain section of the public, if they are perceiving that something is being done for cyclists, then that's a great reason to oppose it. So if we can actually change some of the sort of the emphasis and say, well, actually, you know, these are paths for everybody, and particularly, you know, for disabled people. I've said to Kevin, actually, it would be lovely if somebody's actually got the money to challenge some of these design issues through the Disability Discrimination Act, right? Because they're not designing to standards which are you know, fit for everybody. I think that not only would they do disabled people a great service, they would do a great service to the rest of us as well.
There are a number of people I know who've got severe rheumatoid arthritis. There was one who said the only reason he can get to the market is that he can cycle to the market and then put stuff in his panniers, and then he wouldn't be able to carry those things to the bus. And I've got, my wife's got a niece who's got an electric tricycle, and I'm afraid I can't keep up with it. And she goes all over the place. I mean, she's in her 30s and quite severely disabled, and yet she can go all and then the trike lives almost in the house, so she can easily use that. And I do think it is something which is underestimated, is the ability of people who are disabled to get around on bicycles. Because they're on a bicycle, you often don't realise they are disabled, because they can function perfectly normally on a bicycle. I know somebody whose eyesight is so poor that he's not allowed to drive a car. But I mean, you know, he rides a bike. I mean, you could say, but I mean, basically, you know, I mean, he probably isn't. He's not going at 60 miles an hour. He doesn't have to pass an eyesight. He couldn't pass an eyesight test, but he cycles 3 or 4 miles to work and back. So there is that. I was going to ask an audience participation question, and that is, how much do you think traffic on the main radials drops off by in a half-term week?
A lot.
Well, I get 20. How many? Give me a percentage figure.
7. I'd say more.
40%.
20, 30.
Yeah, I'd say 20%. I drive in from Peterborough to Cambridge every day, and if in half-term weeks, I always use the A14 because I know it's going to be considerably less, and my journey is going to be 20-30 minutes shorter than it is during term time.
I've just got all the data from the automatic traffic counters for October and November for Milton Road and Huntingdon Road, which are the only ones that are working at the moment. And in the 2 peak hours on Milton Road, it drops off by less than 9%.
That's what I was going to say, yeah. Because
and it's this thing that people think it's linear, and so they think that because it takes them twice as long to do their trip, there must be twice as many vehicles. But you can get up to about 80% of the capacity with hardly any delay, and clearly you can never get more than 100% of the capacity through. And one of the troubles with this is that when you ask people, how can we solve the problem, they say, oh, it's insoluble, because they believe they've got to halve the number of cars coming in before you could actually get rid of congestion.
Can I link something to that? My interest is to do with freight transport, which is a link back to the invalidity issue and return shopping trips and so on. We're working on a proposition that we're trying to get off the ground in Cambridge, and having all sorts of challenges with the local authority, which is another subject. But first question is, I'm fascinated to read your book, but do you actually cover freight at all?
It's funny, this question came up at the first talk in Bristol, and I realised that I should have profusely apologised to this man in advance, because some of the people came along with the CILT, of which I'm a member of. And you know, I said in answer to his question, I'm going to cop out on that one, because it actually, the book, now he might have felt misled because the title says all transport, but it would have been a...
Well, no, I'm not challenged by
Yeah.
that.
So my answer is no.
That would be the case.
I defined quite early on, right, that transport is such a huge area.
Yeah.
I'm going to concentrate on transport of people within cities. That's what it's about.
The point really is that I'm very keen to look at the correlation between, or the potential for co-joining, both from the point of view of the infrastructure that's required to carry vehicles. You mentioned earlier about carless cities. Well, okay, hang on a minute, we've still got to get food and drink and so on. There's a beautiful example out here this evening with trucks coming into M&S at 8 o'clock at night, or 7 o'clock at night, and I'm sitting in the lovely little restaurant on the square there having my glass of wine before coming to see you, and there was 2 big M&S lorries, and I was taking photographs of them, and I virtually got attacked by the M&S staff. You know, why are you taking photographs? So, anyway. And there's 2 angles to our approach. We're looking at urban consolidation principles and decanting to smaller, more appropriate urban vehicles. But I got into this, and this was just a complete flight of fancy. We were looking at a thing called freight bus, and the concept being that actually buses, great things, you know, public transport, but they run around with 2 grannies on for 75% of the day. So how efficient is that? Today I've just been with an engine design development company up at Snetterton, some of the Lotus sort of group, and he sat there with a Volvo 7.5 litre engine on a rig. They're trying to decarbonise and do various things. So a 7.5 litre monster engine that is trundling around with 2 grannies on. Now, you know, and you go into London and it's, you know, the whole bus system is great, there's loads of them, but you've got bus jams, you know, absolutely dreadful bus jams. And you look at the buses and they are empty, a lot of them, or near empty. And so we've got 2 completely different functions here, but there's a fantastic opportunity to put the 2 together. Freight will stop on the side of the road and wait quite happily for 3 hours. Get the rush hour out of the way, we'll fill the bus, or other means you can apply to trains as well. Anyway, the question is, have you done any work in this area? Are you familiar with any projects in this area?
No and yes. Freight is not really my thing. 2 things I'll say. On the car-free cities, there's someone called Joel Crawford who was involved in sort of car-free stuff, and I got to know quite well. He's written 2 books called Car-Free Cities and the Car-Free Design Manual that look at the sort of conceptual, okay, let's suppose we were starting from scratch and design a completely new city with no cars. How would you deal with freight and logistics? So that you might find interesting. But at a more practical level, yes, our department, I don't know whether you're aware that we have a freight consolidation centre covering Bristol and Bath.
Very aware of it, yeah.
Right.
It's well publicised, and I've actually been to see the...
Oh, have you? Okay. Well, I was going to say our research unit at UE has been closely involved in monitoring that, and I have a colleague called Miriam Ricci who has, you know, spent years researching it and writing about it. So if you're interested, give me a card or something, I can put you in touch.
You're talking about doing one on the Cambridge North West side.
Yes, there's a lot of talk.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah,
and of course there's also Outspoken who are doing, and now things have changed because now cargo bikes can be the same as EU ones. Then there's a lot more possibility for cargo bikes. Originally, electric cargo bikes couldn't weigh more than a certain amount, which meant that the ones that were built abroad weren't allowed to be used in the UK. But now that's changed.
But it's the market challenge is the biggest challenge in getting the delivery, the normal silo deliveries to stop and decant and so on. Which the only way I think that's going to happen is going to be legislation.
I saw
ultimately.
a 7.5 ton Jones's shoe lorry stop once, and they unloaded 1 pair of shoes. Yeah.
there are retailers on King's Parade, and we've got some data that are having 60 deliveries a week into a little tiny high-end fashion shop on King's Parade. You know, what's it all about? Crazy. 60 deliveries. Yeah.
60?
Yeah, 60 deliveries a week.
I mean, I think if
that is literally a pair of shoes at a time, or a handbag at a time, or whatever, coming in a cardboard box that then gets somebody drives in to pick it up in the Range Rover and take it away. You know.
If we were to get serious about air quality problems, and, you know, ultra low emission zones and things like that. That would, I think, start to push that agenda. Because if you're simply not allowed to bring some of those enormous lorries.
It's interesting what you're saying about the small percentage of additional vehicles, which is surprised me actually related to the school run thing. If you apply the same maths to the relatively small percentage of freight vehicles, although actually the numbers are very high, but it is still a relatively small percentage, whether the impact would be similar.
I think my point is, though, that people think that because they think of it insoluble because they think so many people have to be shifted, but actually, you know, providing more reliable bus services or providing better cycle routes, if you've only got to shift 100 people, I mean, my second measure is that if you look at the queues coming into Cambridge, a queue of cars over a kilometre long is only 100 cars. It's only 100 cars. People think they have these massive queues, but again, that means because of the way queuing theory works, if you take 100 cars out of that module in those 2 hours, there would never be a queue. And so again, moving that sort of thing to show people that actually it isn't insoluble. And I was thinking the other day that maybe you want to have a negative congestion charge, that we actually bribe people. Instead of spending millions of pounds building a bus lane, what we'll do is we'll put all the money in the bank and we'll have an auction for people not to drive in, and they get paid for not driving in. And then
well, it's interesting you say that. Part of the project that we're working on to do with working with the BIT, the Business Improvement District, is a commercial proposition around the park and rides, and the there's obviously a lot of publicity around what's happened recently with the park and rides, in terms of putting a tariff on and so on. But the ability to which is commonplace, to go into a car park and then you go and spend some money and you get a rebate on your car park. Well, why doesn't that happen with the park and ride? So there's an incentive for people to use the park and ride, but of course they go to lots of different shops, so who should pay for it? But there's, technology these days could very easily pick up those kind of solutions, and we're trying to develop something in that space as well.
Of course, John Lewis do have a collection thing there. Yeah. You're almost there with the John Lewis warehouse.
But that's one brand.
That's right, I know. But why can't they be paid to do it for other people?
Yeah.
Can I just express a slightly different opinion? You're absolutely right what you were saying.
There are feedback loops that need to take account of.
Yes. I mean, there's actually a section of the book that says, it's entitled something like "Congestion will always be with us," because I do take the view that congestion is insoluble, right? Not from any technical point of view. Technically, it would be very easy to solve it. It's insoluble for political reasons, because essentially any of the positive things that take traffic off, a road which is congested, then free up space for other people to take their place. So in most cities, you've got the potential demand is far greater than the actual amount of traffic. So there's a great reservoir of additional potential journeys that could be made. So ultimately, if you want to solve congestion, I mean, there are a couple of ways that you can do it, but realistically, you've got to constrain people's ability to drive cars. So, if you look at the London congestion charge, I mean, that's now £11.50 a day, right? That has been just enough to stop congestion from getting much worse. It hasn't got any better. So, that's a measure, and obviously Central London's a slightly funny case, but, if the sort of restraining measures would have to be pretty severe to make a big difference to that. So one of the conclusions that I come to is that, leaving aside, autonomous vehicles is a separate question that we might want to talk about, but leaving that aside, one of the conclusions I come to is that, look, politically, for as long as people like driving cars and car drivers vote, congestion in cities can't be solved. So think of all the effort and the money and that has gone into, over the years, into this, the terrible evil of congestion, what can we do? And yet congestion never gets any better. So just imagine what we could do if we just park that one and say, okay, that's tough, we're going to have to live with that. Now let's turn our attention to problems that we can solve. Imagine what we could do. And that's one of the key conclusions, if you like, of the book.
So what are you saying you can do? Sorry, I don't quite follow you.
Well, we could start to say that our objectives are reducing the amount of traffic, which is not the same. We could, you know, reduce energy use, improving the urban environment, reclaiming space for pedestrians and cyclists, you know, promoting active travel, promoting sociability by removing traffic. You know, all of these things we can do.
But I mean, from a political point of view, surely the challenge is around fairness, and somebody can afford to pay congestion charge, somebody can afford to run the big smoky car or whatever it might be. If there was a diktat that said nobody can drive into central Cambridge, that's it. Politically, I don't see there'd be a problem with that.
Well, that's what the city council tried to do.
Yeah.
Well,
they tried to put in a congestion charge.
They tried to put in a congestion.
They didn't try to limit.
But how far did they try?
They tried to put in a congestion card. The difficulty was because the press were against it. They said everybody was against it. When if you looked at the statistics, you'll find that about 60% of the people were for it,
Yeah.
as long as the money collected was spent on transport.
Yeah.
And the press decided to forget all about that and
Yeah.
assume that all was happening was that people were being charged to come in and the money wasn't being
But
used to improve
the
the situation.
fundamental problem is that the politicians are looking for the next election. That's all they're interested in, is being re-elected. And until the system changes, and also with the Cambridge, you've got the City Council, the County Council, you've got blue, red, pink, orange, all the bloody political mishmash in there. I've been now 2 years trying to get this project off the ground, going from department to department, councillor to councillor, and it's just a farce. The whole thing is a farce. They can't even decide. They've got this city deal, okay? $750 million, is it? And the first phase is 120 million, okay? And they've been given this 120 million. They can't even decide how to spend the 120 million. And the deadline for having made a decision to go back to central government to say we've got some good projects is running out.
Well, there's a question in this for Steve, which is to do with the city deal and the way it's being spent at the moment. And you may not know, but there's several planning decisions on the table at the moment involving improvements to cycle infrastructure. And one of the really interesting questions for me is they're proposing to build these wider cycle lanes that you've been talking about, but at the expense of green verges, green space, urban green space, and a lot of trees. And I'm like you, I'm a really keen cyclist, also a lover of the countryside, and really attached to these green spaces in town. Cambridgeshire is one of the counties in the country with the least tree cover. We need urban trees in Cambridge. And I'm really torn. I'm actually unable to say if I prefer to have a wider cycle lane or prefer to keep the trees. But what's your stance on that?
Oh, I mean, that's a difficult one, but my answer would be, well, you know, can't you plant more trees somewhere else? You know, if you say, right, we're going to plant twice as many trees as we're cutting down, then I think that would presumably address at least some.
Go down Milton Road.
They're all ornamental trees anyway. They're not naturally
they're not
there.
Go down Milton Road and measure the amount of paving on people's front gardens. And compare that. So the people who are complaining about these scraggy cherry trees going out, most of which have died, are the very people who've paved over their front gardens so they can put 3 cars on their front garden.
I object to the paving.
Yeah, okay. I know.
But I've thought for most of my life that tarmac is the enemy.
Yeah.
So the idea of putting down more
It is for other reasons.
Yeah, that's right. It's quite easy. It's quite easy to get permission to put down a 1,000 space park and ride site on a greenbelt area. That seems to be easy, and nobody seems to complain about that.
You talked about economic benefits, and Jim's been talking to me about economic benefits. You know, you're only allowed to justify the projects on economic benefits, and so things like one of the things that struck me was that improving the urban environment adds value to to the buildings and everything around it. Does that count as economic benefit? Because it isn't in the GDP.
Steve may not know this, but the city deal does not allow you to have... It disadvantages active travel because you're only allowed to include direct economic benefits. You're not allowed to include health benefits. If these were schemes that were funded under a DFT City Ambition deal or an LSTF, you could include the health benefits by converting people. But for the city deal, which is funded direct from the Treasury, you're not allowed to include those benefits.
Right, okay.
Can you just tell us what the initials stood for?
Actually, I was going to say, yes, some of this discussion, has everybody followed this discussion? We've got into some quite technical...
Except for one thing, when you talked about, if you did talk about combining passenger transport and freight transport, are you being literal about that?
Yeah.
So in other words, you'd have a bus, a portion of which would be carrying passengers
Exactly.
and freight in the back.
Exactly. If you Google freight bus,
That's very
you'll see
interesting.
my design, which is a bus that carries freight.
Freight bus.
In rural areas, this happened 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, it's absolutely.
You know, if
It's not rocket science.
the Yorkshire Dales where my parents lived,
Yeah.
if the local garage wanted a starter motor for a car, they'd ring up the factor in
Yeah.
Skipton and he'd go and put it on the bus.
Yeah, it's the same on the trains. There's a thing called Red Star. You know,
Yeah, but actually, right, there's somebody doing some
Yeah.
work now. One of the innovative schemes that's come up for some awards on the rail is to have a system whereby it's got effectively folding concertina seats for part of the train, so you can start to run
There's
that.
a company in St Ives, actually, local, who
Yeah.
are working on exactly
Yeah.
that project. But, sorry, coming back to politics, within your
Yeah,
tour of
yeah,
Europe,
I do want to come back to economic benefits.
yeah,
but
yeah,
go on.
well, it's
yeah.
sort of wrapped up in that.
Yeah.
Have you come across a good political solution? What I can't understand is that, as you rightly say, is that Holland particularly and other European states are ahead of us, or appear to be ahead of us, on the social front. Is there a particular structure that works better for getting resolution, getting these projects off the ground and making decisions? Rightly or wrong decisions, but at least making a bloody decision.
Yes, yeah. Basically, most other European countries have a greater degree of devolution of power. So that's the first thing. Second thing is city-region structures. Again, Britain is not unusual in having sort of small, areas, city areas, for example, that don't cover the whole city. And the suburbs are part of another authority or whatever. But in most other places, there is some sort of city-regional structure. So I think that's particularly important for the public transport aspects. Now, the city deal and stuff like that was an attempt. Now, but if you say if their Treasury are then imposing more of their own conditions on it, then that kind of defeats the whole object.
Yeah,